Chapter 7, Applying the Redundancy Principle, narrated by Kelly Ayers. Research shows that learning is optimized when graphics are accompanied by audio narration. However, research also tells us that learning is hindered when graphics are accompanied by both audio narration and on screen text. In this case, the on screen text becomes redundant to the audio narration, creating an unnecessary cognitive load and impeding the learner's ability to process the incoming information. This is the guiding theory behind e-learning's redundancy principle, which, according to Clark and Mayer, advises us to explain visuals with words and audio or text, but not both. The redundancy principle is rooted in the cognitive theory of multimedia learning, which states that A, learners have separate channels for processing audio and visual information, B, each of these channels has an upper limit, and C, that learners will work to construct mental models using incoming information. In the case of graphics with narration, the narration is processed through the learner's auditory channel, while the graphics are processed through the learner's visual channel. Redundant on-screen text is also processed via the visual channel, forcing the learner to process twice the amount of visual information, leading to cognitive overload and impeding overall learning. So it's important to keep in mind that more information doesn't necessarily equate to greater learning. In this learning example, the learner sees an image alongside an on-screen text, hearing that same text narrated. Since both the on-screen text and graphic are received through the visual channel, the existence of both in the activity increases the learner's cognitive load and causes extra processing. In addition, some learners may find themselves trying to compare the on-screen text to the narration, further increasing that extra processing. In this next example, the on-screen text has been removed from the learning activity, but the narration still remains. By removing the on-screen text, the learner's visual and auditory channels are balanced. This reduces the cognitive load the learner will have to experience while trying to take part in learning in this activity. There are special situations in which having audio narration and on-screen text would be actually acceptable. The key to is avoid overloading the learner's visual information processing system. For example, if there's no presence of pictures, including videos, graphics, etc., there is less of a chance of overloading the learner in the processing of this new information because they can give the narration their undivided attention as opposed to being distracted by an excess of things coming at them all at once. It would also be acceptable to use both audio narration and pictures in situations where only a few keywords are used. This could actually enhance rather than detract from understanding if done correctly. When considering the exceptions to the redundancy principle, the most vital piece is whether the learner's processing demands are being diminished in any way due to the overload of information, or does the information ultimately work in cooperation with each other to enhance overall learning and processing of new information? Are the visual and verbal channels working in cooperation or against each other as the learner processes each new piece of information? Redundant wording impedes learning, but carefully placed words can result in both channels working together by carefully getting the learner's attention. This concept is called signaling. In this next example of narration of on-screen text, this would read more quickly to themselves than the narrator. This situation causes cognitive overload on learners. According to Clark, the students who used narration and redundant on-screen text performed worse than students who used narration alone. This makes this a very interesting example. In this next example, it's a good example of an e-learning tool with narration alone. The strength of narration is the students focus listening to the text and watching the visual design at the same time. That explains the balanced situation of the two channels of visual and auditory actually working together in cooperation. As we conclude, there are a couple of comprehension questions to consider. First off, why is it important to avoid using on-screen text in conjunction with narration? What are some instances you would use them apart? Another good one is, under what circumstances can on-screen text along narration actually be helpful? When could those two work cooperatively side by side? And finally, our references.